I had meant to walk straight to my car, but then I stopped cold. Across the oil-stained pavement, under the blood-red wash of sunset, a rusted shopping cart leaned sideways, and inside it, a pair of wide brown eyes, wet and unblinking, fixed on me. At first, I thought I was mistaken. From that distance, it could have been a rag, a bundle of trash left behind. But then the shape stirred, trembling in broken jerks, and the truth came clear. A Doberman pup, no more than 3 or 4 months old, so thin that each rib jutted sharply beneath a coat matted with dust and sweat and curled tight, shaking as if the whole weight of the world was crushing him down. But what clenched my chest wasn't only that frail body. It was what he carried in his mouth, a faded blue teddy bear. One ear gone, seams ripped, stuffing spilling out, grime seeping into every thread. Worthless to anyone else. But to that puppy, it was everything. He bit down hard as if it were the last scrap of life left to him. No bark, no whimper, no plea. Just those eyes, locked to mine, the silence suffocating. A question hanging heavy in the air. Are you going to leave me too? The grocery bags slid from my hands and crashed onto the asphalt, the sound sharp, echoing louder than my breath. I froze. I couldn't turn away. Others kept passing by. A young mother tugged her daughter past the cart. The girl squealed, pointing inside. "Mommy, look, a dog." The mother gave a glance, then pulled the child faster. "Don't touch it." A couple of teenagers shoved a heavy cart by, glancing at me before smirking, shaking their heads like I was some fool wasting time with garbage. No one stopped. Not one soul. But I couldn't move forward either. I stepped closer, each pace dragging like a weight tied to my legs. The nearer I got, the clearer it became. Those brown eyes were soaked but not frantic, not begging, just waiting. As if testing one last time. Was there anyone left in this world worth trusting? I crouched beside the cart. The heat of the pavement burned through my jeans. Tar stung the air. Car engines hummed in the distance, but it all blurred. There was only me and the dog in the rusted steel cage. I lowered my voice, whispered, "Hey, buddy." He trembled harder, jaws clamping tighter on the ruined bear, eyes never breaking from mine. His ears folded back, body pressed against the bars, bracing for another blow. But the gaze held. I looked around. No collar, no leash, no note. Just a few crumbs scattered at the bottom of the cart. No one was coming back. I placed my hand slowly onto the pavement where he could see it, empty and bare. No leash, no whip. Just a man sitting down to say without words, "I'm not leaving." In that moment, my chest locked up. I remembered the days I had volunteered at the shelter, the faces of dogs whose trust had been shattered. Some howled until their voices broke. Some lashed out at anyone who came close. Others sat in silence, eyes glazed, ghosts waiting to disappear. But this one, this small broken pup, didn't fit any of those. He wasn't begging. He wasn't raging. He hadn't given up completely. He was just waiting, waiting for someone, waiting to see if this time could be different. I drew a long breath, my lungs heavy with stone. I knew, if I stood and walked away, those eyes would follow me for the rest of my life. There are moments when you have to stop, when turning away would scar you forever. And in the middle of that Safeway parking lot, I knew this was one of them. I sat close to the cart, my back pressed against the burning asphalt, my empty hands resting on my knees. Ranger never looked away from me. Those brown eyes were a locked door, cracked open just a sliver, waiting to see whether I would force my way in, or wait with patience. I knew that with an abandoned dog, every movement carried weight. One step too quick, one glance too sharp, and the fragile thread between survival and surrender could snap. I had to choose another way. I let out a slow breath, steady and deep. Then I pulled from my jacket pocket half a turkey and cheese sandwich I had bought for the ride home. It was cold now, the cheese stiff, but the scent of turkey lingered strong. I tore off a small piece, set it beside the wheel, then drew my hand back. I made sure not to stare at Ranger. Instead, I turned my head toward the rows of parked cars, pretending I was only resting. In that instant, it felt like I had wagered my whole heart on a small gesture. An engine roared somewhere, faded into the distance. A family passed by, children laughing, stroller wheels squealing on the pavement. Life went on around me in its steady stream. But for me, time had stalled. 1 minute. Nothing. Ranger stayed still, eyes unblinking, the blue bear clenched in his jaws. A thought stabbed through me. Maybe he was too far gone to care. Maybe even food couldn't pull him back. 2 minutes. Still no movement. My chest felt like lead. I turned back, and his eyes were still on me. Not angry, not desperate, just measuring, testing if this man would really wait. 3 minutes. I heard the sharp hitch of his breathing, quick and broken. Then, a faint sound, a soft rustle. I shifted my eyes sideways. Ranger had stretched his neck out, nose trembling at the air, drinking in the smell of food. His eyes were still locked on mine, but his body edged forward. Just inches, but enough to make my heart leap. He froze, retreated, and clamped the bear tighter. I didn't move, didn't breathe hard. I knew if I startled him, everything would collapse. More minutes dragged by. I kept my posture still, gaze fixed far ahead. Then another sound, a scrape of claws against rusted steel. I glanced over. The piece of sandwich was gone. Ranger was chewing slowly, cautiously, as if afraid the food might vanish at any moment. My eyes burned hot. It wasn't just a bite of bread. It was a leap of faith. He still held his toy, but he had stepped out of the shell of fear, if only slightly, to accept something from a human hand. A crumb, yes, but to me it was a beginning. I repeated the act. Tore off another piece, set it down, turned away again. This time he moved faster. Still wary, still refusing to meet my eyes head-on, but hunger tugged harder than fear. After a few tries, I could see the slight swell of his belly beneath the ragged fur. Still trembling, still cautious, but no longer completely sealed off. The sun bled out of the sky. Above Portland, the clouds burned orange-red. Parking lot lamps flickered on, throwing cold white light across the oil-slick pavement. Footsteps thinned, voices faded. I leaned back against the tire of my truck, sitting close beside the cart. Ranger remained curled inside, the teddy wedged beneath his chin, his eyes glowing beneath the streetlight. But something had shifted. Each time I exhaled, he didn't flinch. Each time a car rolled past, he didn't press himself into the bars. He only watched, waiting, and maybe, for the first time, trying to believe. I remembered a dog at the rescue years ago, a big one, who turned his back on the world for 2 days straight. No food, no water. On the 3rd day, he turned his head just once, only a glance, but it was enough to make me believe in miracles. And now, I knew I was reliving that moment. I leaned closer, whispered under my breath, half to myself, "I'm not going anywhere, Ranger." I hadn't named him yet, but in my mind, the name had already taken root. Ranger. Not because he was strong, but because he had guarded himself in that rusted cage, like a silent sentry, unbroken, uncrying. And I knew then, with absolute certainty, I would never leave him behind. The sun had slipped fully behind the Cascades. The Portland sky bruised into a heavy purple-gray streaked clouds bleeding like spilled ink. In the parking lot, the lamps flickered to life, throwing down their cold white glare, dragging the shadow of the rusted cart long across the oil-stained pavement. The place had thinned out. Only a few cars remained, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. I knew I couldn't sit there forever. Ranger had eaten a few scraps of sandwich, his tiny belly swollen just slightly, but his legs still shook, his eyes still sagged with exhaustion. If I walked away, he would spend the night alone in that cage of steel and shadow. I couldn't imagine what the dark would do to him. I pushed myself to my feet, legs tingling with pins and needles, knees burning sharply after hours folded on the ground. I opened the truck door and reached behind the seat. An old gray blanket, frayed at the edges, the kind I used on long drives. I folded it under my arm and walked back slowly toward the cart. Ranger stiffened instantly, eyes locked on every movement I made. The teddy was still clenched tight in his mouth. He didn't growl, didn't whimper. He only watched, waiting for what came next. I sat again, spread the blanket open before him, then slid my hand through the bars and laid it across the metal floor. The contrast struck me, the frozen steel beneath and the soft weave above. My throat tightened. I pulled my hand out, left it open in my lap so he could see I was hiding nothing. The night air swept across the lot, carrying the sting of gasoline and damp from the Douglas firs beyond. The blanket shifted faintly in the draft. Ranger stared, motionless. Time stretched. A minute, then 2. And then he set the teddy down, just for an instant, but enough to knot my chest. He lowered his nose to the blanket, sniffed tentatively. One paw edged forward, trembling. I held my breath. Then another paw. My voice cracked into the silence. "Good boy. It's okay, Ranger." It was the first time I called him that. I don't know why. The name just rose, unbidden, like a promise made aloud. He didn't collapse onto the blanket, not fully. He only lowered himself part way, eyes still fastened to me. But that was enough. A first stone was laid across the gulf of fear. Slowly, I bent closer, slipped my hand inside, gripped the edge of the blanket, and began to lift. Ranger froze, body shaking like a brittle branch in the wind. I stopped, waited. No growl, no snap. Just his breath quick and shallow, eyes wide as coins. I whispered low, steady. "Shh, I got you." I pulled the blanket around him, wrapping him into a soft cocoon, sheltering that quaking frame. He stiffened for a beat. Then, suddenly, no more resistance, no thrashing, no bite. Just a trembling collapse as he let his head fall, cheek pressed hard against my chest. I lifted him from the cart, weightless. Barely 10 kilos, if that. Yet in my arms, he was heavy as stone, heavy as the years pressed into my heart. His face pressed against me, his tiny heartbeat hammering frantic, a drum of panic and survival. I waited for the struggle, but it never came. He only clung tighter, searching for a shadowed corner to breathe, as if at last he had allowed himself to surrender. I stood motionless in the lot, Ranger curled inside the blanket, teddy bear crushed against his belly like an anchor to memory. My throat closed, forcing me into short, uneven breaths. I could hear his broken gasps right by my ear. I whispered, "You're safe now. You're not going back there. Not ever." I opened the truck door, set him carefully on the back seat, still bundled in the blanket. The bear slipped from his mouth and lay across his stomach. Ranger curled tighter, eyes wide open, silent, just watching me, gaze drilling through, asking one thing. Is it true? Will you stay? I slid behind the wheel. My hand rested on the steering wheel, but I didn't turn the key. I looked into the rearview mirror. Those brown eyes clung to me. Beneath his chin, the faded Teddy glowed pale under the dome light, a shadow of a past that refused to release him. What I felt wasn't pity anymore. It was a vow, a bond that needed no words. I turned the key. The engine rumbled, headlights slicing through the dark. The truck rolled out of the Safeway lot, leaving behind the rusted cart, leaving behind the cold asphalt. In the back seat, Ranger lay still, eyes open, head resting against the worn toy, once abandoned, now straddling the fragile line between silence and hope, and I knew, tonight, nothing in my life would ever be the same again. The road home lay strangely empty. The headlights of the old truck cut a narrow beam through the dark silhouette of Douglas firs. In the back seat, Ranger lay curled in the blanket, his head resting on the worn blue Teddy. His brown eyes stayed wide, unblinking, locked on me through the rearview mirror. Each time that gaze touched mine, my chest cinched tight. There was no doubt anymore. It was a silent question. Are you really taking me home? My cabin came into view after the bend. Dark wood walls, slanted porch roof, a single porch light casting a soft amber glow. I had lived there alone for years, after a marriage that had come apart. A quiet house, too wide for one man. But now, for the first time, it didn't feel empty. I shut off the engine and opened the door. Ranger jerked upright, ears flat, eyes startled. I walked slowly to the back seat, voice low. It's okay, Ranger. We're home. The word home slipped out, sounding foreign even to me. But I knew I wanted it to be true. I lifted him in my arms, still bundled in the blanket. His body was light, but the tremors weighed heavily, like winter air cutting through flesh. I carried him inside and laid him gently in the corner of the living room, near a cold fireplace that hadn't been lit in years. I spread another worn towel for him to rest on. In the small wooden room, silence was so complete I could hear his faint, careful breaths. Ranger never let go of the Teddy, his eyes tracking me with each step I took. I went into the kitchen, filled a bowl with clean water, and found some soft food left in the cupboard. I set both on the floor, then stepped back. He hesitated, sniffed the air, then lowered his head and began to drink, slow sips. The sound of water rippling filled the room, small but sharp, and it made my eyes sting. It sounded like a sigh, like a piece of life being returned. He nibbled a few bites of food, then retreated to the blanket, curled around the Teddy. I dimmed the lights, leaving only the golden glow of a lamp, and lay down on the sofa across from him. From there, he could see me. I wanted him to know I wasn't leaving. The night stretched long. I didn't sleep. Every time I opened my eyes, his brown gaze was still on me from the corner of the room. No cries, no sound, just watching, as if to be certain I was still there. Around 3 a.m., I heard a soft rustle. Ranger rose, Teddy in his mouth, stepping carefully, hesitantly, toward me. He placed the toy beside the sofa, then lay down with his back pressed against it, just inches away. He didn't reach for my hand, didn't beg. He only needed to be close. I bent my head and whispered, I'm right here. He let out a long breath, thin as wind. But to me, it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. A breath of release, a breath of trust. When the pale light of dawn filtered through the curtains, I sat up. Ranger had drifted into sleep, head resting on the teddy, chest rising in a steady rhythm. No more violent tremors, only a fragile peace. I sat motionless, eyes blurring as I watched. A Doberman, once left to die in a rusted cart, was now sleeping safely in my wooden home. I knew then I had witnessed something unforgettable. Not just Ranger's first night of survival, but the first night we both began to learn how to trust again. The days that followed that first night changed the rhythm of my cabin in ways I hadn't foreseen. Ranger wasn't the kind of dog who tore through rooms or made noise for attention. He moved quietly, always keeping a careful distance, like a small shadow. When I worked at my desk, he curled beneath my feet. When I stepped out onto the porch to water the plants, he lay just inside the door, eyes tracking me without pause. What haunted me most was the old blue teddy. Ranger never let it out of his reach. At night it was tucked beneath his chin. In the day, clenched between his teeth. I began to think of it as the anchor of someone who had lost everything, holding tight to the last fragment so he wouldn't be swept away. One afternoon, while I was buried in paperwork, a knock sounded at the door. I opened it to find Hannah Brooks standing there. Hannah had been my friend since high school. Now she worked as a social services officer, often stopping by with flyers about programs for families and animals in need. She was the kind of woman with a smile like sunlight and a voice soft as wind. "Matt, I heard from the neighbors that you brought home a dog." I gestured toward the living room. Ranger lay curled near the fireplace, Teddy tucked under his chin, eyes locked on the doorway. The moment Hannah stepped inside, Ranger stiffened, his whole body taut, breath shallow, eyes sharp with alarm. I started to speak, to reassure, but Hannah raised a hand, silently telling me not to. She crouched slowly, keeping her distance. Her gaze angled just slightly off, never directly into his eyes, enough to ease the challenge. She extended her hand, palm open, quiet and steady. "Hey there," she whispered. "You must be the brave one." I held my breath. Ranger clamped tighter on the toy, but then he moved. One small step, trembling, then another, until his nose brushed against the hollow of her palm. In that second, time stalled. He pressed his nose into her hand. No growl, no retreat, just touch, and my eyes burned. Hannah glanced up at me, her face lit with something fierce and gentle all at once. "Matt, do you know? I've worked on hundreds of rescues, but I rarely see a dog carry this kind of energy. He doesn't seek attention, he doesn't demand, he just exists. And sometimes that quiet presence is the very thing that heals." I swallowed hard, words tangled in my throat. Ranger had already lain down beside her, eyes half closed, as though he had just handed over his first piece of trust beyond me. That night, I sat on the sofa. Ranger stretched near my feet, Teddy nestled close. I didn't sleep. Hannah's words beat in my mind like a drum. His presence is the thing that heals. I started to wonder, could it be that this dog, once abandoned in a rusted cart, had a greater purpose than just survival? That he was born not only to endure, but to turn his scars into a bridge for others? The next morning, I called Hannah. My voice trembled, but I knew I had to ask. If I wanted to try Ranger in a therapy dog program, where would I even start? On the other end, silence for a breath. Then her laugh, soft and certain. "Matt, that might be the best thing you'll ever do. For him and for yourself." She sent me a list. Training centers in Salem, certification steps, and the basic requirements. I printed the pages and spread them on the desk. My hand shook as I read. A part of me whispered, "Ranger isn't ready." But the truth sat deeper. I was the one who wasn't ready. That evening, I watched Ranger curled by the fireplace, still holding the teddy, but his eyes no longer frantic, only quiet, steady, fixed on me. I whispered into the room, "You trusted me in that cold parking lot. Now it's my turn to learn to trust you." And in that moment, I understood. Ranger's life wasn't defined by being rescued. That was only the beginning. On Ranger's first day at the training center in Salem, I was more nervous than he was. The parking lot was crowded, full of barking dogs, trainers moving briskly between classes, and leashes tangling in every direction. I gripped his lead tightly, my heart hammering like a drum. Ranger walked beside me, the old blanket still wrapped around his thin frame, eyes fixed on me, silent. The trainer, a silver-haired woman with short-cropped hair, crouched to greet him. I braced for him to flinch, to tremble, but he didn't. Ranger stood steady. No barking, no jumping, just watching with a calm that didn't seem possible. The first test was sit. My throat tightened as I gave the command. Ranger lowered himself instantly, eyes never leaving me. Stay. He held still. Heel. He moved at my side, slow, measured. The trainer shook her head, smiling. This dog doesn't look like a rescue case. It's as if he's been waiting for this moment all along. My throat closed. I couldn't find words. Week by week, Ranger learned more, never rushing, never demanding attention, just following in silence, as though the only thing he needed was my nod of approval. I began to realize his silence wasn't empty. It was a gift, a space of safety for anyone near him. Our first field practice was at a children's hospital. My palms were slick with sweat as I tightened my grip on the leash. The door opened, revealing 10 children sitting in a circle, each clutching a stuffed animal, a blanket, or a worn photograph. The room was heavy, drained of laughter. I whispered, "Easy, Ranger." He stepped forward, head lifted just slightly, ears pricked but gentle. He didn't rush toward the calls, didn't seek pats or praise. Instead, he chose. A little girl with brown hair, maybe 7, curled tight in the corner, clutching a torn, stuffed fox. Ranger walked to her, settled at her side, motionless. 1 minute, then 2. The girl lifted her head, eyes wary. Her hand trembled as she reached out and touched the top of his head. And then, her smile, fragile, fleeting, but real enough that I had to turn away and wipe my eyes. Weeks later, we visited a support center for children who had lost their parents. Again, Ranger chose. Not the loudest child, not the one calling his name, but a boy sitting at the back, head bowed, silent. Ranger lowered himself in front of him, quiet as stone. 5 minutes passed. Then the boy's hand reached out, resting on Ranger's fur. A single tear fell. And in that instant, I understood. Ranger didn't need words. His presence was enough. And that presence had more power than anything I had ever seen. That night, back at the wooden cabin in the forest, I watched him stretched out by the fireplace, the blue teddy still tucked beneath his chin. I whispered, "You weren't just saved, Ranger. You were born to save." And for the first time in years, I believed that miracles truly exist. We went through many visits, hospitals, classrooms, rooms filled with grief. Each time, Ranger left me speechless. He never sought attention, never needed applause. He only searched out the one child sitting in silence, bowed under the weight, and settled beside them. And somehow that silence broke the shell of coldness. But there was one day I know I will never forget. We were visiting a center for children who had just lost their parents in an accident. The room was painfully still. 10 children sat in a row, the air heavier than any funeral. I took a breath and whispered, "Easy, Ranger." He walked in, unhurried, head slightly raised, steps steady. My eyes scanned the line. A boy at the end, maybe 10 years old. Gray hoodie, face buried, unmoving. Since the accident, he hadn't cried, hadn't spoken. He just sat, like a stone. Ranger went straight to him. No pause, no hesitation. He sat directly in front, unmoving. 1 minute, 2. My heart pounded loudly in my ears. Then Ranger lowered his head, and for the first time, he let go of the faded blue teddy, the one he had clutched in the rusted cart, the one that had been his lifeline. He placed it at the boy's feet. The room froze. I swallowed hard, unable to believe what I was seeing. The boy lifted his face. Eyes once empty suddenly broke wide. His shoulders shook. Tears spilled, silent but unstoppable. No sobs, no wails, just streams of tears, the first since that day that shattered his world. He bent down, lifted the teddy, and pressed it to his chest. Ranger didn't bark, didn't leap. He only sat, silent, brown eyes glowing as if he knew he had just given away the last piece of his past. A social worker leaned close and whispered, "Matt, that's the first time he's cried." I turned away, my own tears falling. I couldn't hide them. In that moment, I understood. Ranger no longer needed the teddy. It had served its purpose, keeping him alive until he was strong enough to let it go, and by giving it away, he turned his pain into a bridge for another soul. When the session ended, the boy still clutched the teddy. I stepped forward, ready to retrieve it. But then I knew. I knelt, whispered to Ranger, "You don't need it anymore, do you?" Ranger looked at me. His eyes no longer carried the shadows of that cart, only stillness, strength. I nodded and left the teddy behind. That night in the wooden cabin, Ranger lay stretched by the window. No teddy under his chin, just steady breathing, deep sleep. I sat beside him, running my hand down his back. He was no longer the frightened pup gripping the past. He was free. I whispered, "You're not just a rescued dog, Ranger. You are the rescuer. You've turned your own pain into a gift." He didn't answer, only sighed, resting his head against my leg. But in that breath, I heard peace, as though the world had finally tilted back into place. In the months that followed, Ranger's name spread. Schools, hospitals, shelters, they all asked for us. I still felt nervous each time we stepped through a new doorway, but Ranger never gave me reason to doubt. Every time, he chose the one who needed him most. Every time, he was there, quiet, steady, enough to remind people they weren't invisible. And I began to see I was healing too. I had thought I was the rescuer, the one who pulled him from the rusted cart. But the truth was, Ranger had pulled me from my own darkness, the emptiness after a broken marriage, the years of drifting through life without really living. One evening, I sat on the porch, Ranger stretched at my feet, the Douglas firs whispering in the wind. I remembered that first look in the Safeway lot, the eyes asking, "Are you going to leave me too?" If I had walked away that day, none of this would exist. The 10-year-old boy would still sit in silence. The girl in the hospital would never have smiled, and I would still be wandering without faith in miracles. I turned to Ranger and whispered, "I thought I saved you, but the truth is, you saved me." His ears flicked, eyes opened for a beat, then closed again. No words needed. I sat there a long time, feeling my heartbeat fall into rhythm with his breath, and I knew some miracles only happen when you stop, when you kneel beside the rusted cart in a cold parking lot and choose not to walk away. If you believe in second chances, in unconditional love, hit like, subscribe, and share this video. Because sometimes saving a dog isn't just about giving them a home, it's about finding the humanity we've lost in ourselves. Be the one who stops. Be the one who doesn't walk away. Because somewhere out there, another ranger is waiting.